Okay, I call this ad fontes just because this is something that I try and practice, and it's been really helpful to me. Ad fontes is a Latin phrase meaning to the fountains or to the sources. Um, if I recall right, it came into use in the late Middle Ages, Renaissance, Reformation times when people wanted to look back into the sources for to they wanted to get back to like the Hebrew of the Old Testament, if I recall right. And feel free to exercise the principle and check me on that. But the reason why I am streaming this is because I happened to use it today, and I've done this a lot in studying things and going to school. Um, Going to school is useful. One of the things that I really did learn from going to college was how to use research materials, how to um, how to read uh, scholarly literature, what it's there for, why people format it the way that they do, um, and that was helpful for me. In part, even just seeing how um, little source documents get used in a lot of research literature. Like you'll have a paper about Gilgamesh, and you won't you won't see a whole lot of people actually quoting Gilgamesh very infrequently. Usually, it's just other scholars' opinions on Gilgamesh. Just as an example. So all that to say, I am right now going through this commentary. I'm doing a study on the first chapter of Genesis for our church gathering, and this is a pretty good one. It's by C. John Collins, um, and this coming Sunday, we're going to be going over the second day, which is the creation of the firmament and the separation of the waters beneath and the waters above. Now, I honestly still don't have down what I believe the waters above are. But as far as the firmament goes, the really popular idea now amongst academics is kind of like what you'll find among John Walton type guys. They think that the Hebrews, the early Hebrews, whoever wrote the Pentateuch in their mind, I don't think they believe it's really Moses that wrote it. Um, but anyway, they think that the Genesis account is actually just kind of riffing off of and based off of Mesopotamian religion and cosmology. And therefore, when they read Genesis, when they read the Bible, they're not coming at it as something that is that's that's transcendently divine, that would be giving true information. And they'll say that it's true. They'll say that it's religiously true, but they won't really explain what that means. They'll say, "Oh, it's full of religious meaning. It's meant to tell us about God," and then they'll rattle off something confusing, um, that really doesn't in to my mind make God seem any more worthy of worship. Just usually some kind of self-referential thing to some other part of the Bible. Um, but I bring that in to say that there's this idea that the firmament, in the minds of the people who wrote the Bible, was like a hard dome. And if you want, you can find verses that seem to support that idea. Like in Job, it talks about uh, God spreads out the firmament hard as a mirror of cast bronze or something like that. In The word is actually strong. It's strong as a mirror of cast bronze, and um, I could see how that could support that idea, but I don't think that's true. Obviously, I don't think that God that God told Moses that um, that we live on a disk with a dome above it, and there's little glowy stars stuck in this disk, um, which is what a lot of these academic commentaries that you'll read will try and tell you. So this is not that kind of commentary for the most part. The guy that wrote this, C. John Collins, he actually thinks Adam was a real guy, And so I was curious to see what he thought of the firmament. So I look it up, and he talks about it, and he says we could translate it vault or canopy if we'd wanted. The Hebrew term rakia. We have here a prime example of phenomenological description. That is, things are described as they appear and not scientifically. That's clearly not a description of a vapor canopy or a cloud cover, as such, as seen from the use of this term in Psalm 19:2 and Daniel 12:3, denoting what we now know, or what we see now. And the fact that in Genesis 1:8 God names the extended surface sky with which we're familiar. Okay, skipping on. The traditional English firmament comes from firmamentum, the Latin rendering of the Septuagint stereoma, firm or solid thing. Sirach 43:1 and 8 describes it as a clear solid. Philo on the creation 36 tells us it is called firmament because this body is by nature firm, stereon. The Hebrew does not require Philo's level of literalism, however. So, C. John Collins is saying Philo, who was a Jewish guy who was at least in part contemporary of Jesus, lived, I believe, a little bit earlier in Alexandria in Egypt. Jewish philosopher whose writings I actually think are pretty interesting. So I was kind of surprised and a little bit shook up to think that Philo thought that the firmament meant it was this hard thing up in the sky somewhere, right? So so I thought, well, ad fontes, let me actually look into Philo and see what Philo says, because I don't know how many times this has happened to me where I will read something and I'll get shaken up because I'm convinced that the scriptures are that they're the word of God, that there is a God that made the universe, and that the scriptures are not a sociological record of what a particular people um, thought about God or their experiences of the divine or whatever. I think that the scriptures are what they actually say they are, God speaking to men by prophets. And the Pentateuch is written by Moses from God and actually would give accurate information, difficult to understand, yes, but accurate information about the universe. So it kind of was uh, um, a disturbing thing to think that Philo, a Jew at that time, thought, knowing Hebrew as I'm sure he did, that the firmament was a solid thing. Wouldn't make me think that it was, um, but it was enough to disturb me. And I've had enough times where things like that have happened in the past, and I've gone back to the original source, and it didn't actually say whatever book I was reading said that it said. Where the original author, the author that they're quoting, if you look at the context of it, and if you look at what they're actually saying, doesn't support the position that the person who's writing the book and quoting them holds, or even says that that quote supports. So this is one of those cases. I went back, I took a look at Philo, read his On the Creation. Here we go. I got my Philo spread out here, and it is um, 36. So that's the part he quotes. And remember, John Collins said that Philo says that it's called a firmament because this body is by nature firm, stereon. That part is in Greek there. So in Philo, he says this. The incorporeal world, then, was already completed, having its seat in the divine reason, and the world, perceptible by the external senses, was made on the model of it. And the first portion of it, being also the most excellent of all made by the Creator, was the heaven, which he truly called the firmament, as being corporeal, for the body is by nature firm, inasmuch as it is divisible into three parts. And what other idea of solidity in a body can there be, except that it is something which may be measured in every direction? Therefore, he, very naturally contrasting that which was perceptible to the external senses and corporeal, which with that which was perceptible only by the intellect and incorporeal, called this the firmament. So you can tell Philo is not saying that this thing, the firmament, the rakia, is solid or hard like a body. He's contrasting it with his idea, Philo's idea, that God had kind of conceived the spiritual, intellectual universe and the world, and was now proceeding to make a manifest physical copy of the universe. And he's saying, okay, well, it makes sense to call it a firmament because it's actually physical. So John C. Collins sees that and says, oh, well, Philo obviously thinks that it's a solid because he calls it a firmament and says that body is by nature firm, stereon. Well, what Philo means by firm, he defines exactly. Um, he says, what other idea of solidity in a body can there be except that it is something which may be measured in every direction? So all that Philo is saying is that the firmament, whatever it is an actual physical substance. It's not an intellectual property. It's not a. It doesn't belong to the non-physical intellectual world. Um, but it's a solid. It has boundaries. He doesn't mean that it's hard like a rock. That's not what he means at all. And it's pretty obvious to tell that when he's reading it. He's saying, okay, well, it's by nature firm in as much as it's divisible into three parts. Like his right away, as soon as he says by nature firm, he says, oh yeah, it's firm because you can cut it up. That's not the sort of firm that you'd think of if you think that it's hard as a cast bronze mirror. Philo's idea is that its firmness means that it's a real physical entity of some sort. It could be a gas, could be a liquid, um, but that's his primary point is just that it's physical. It's not an intellectual property. And I'm repeating myself now, but all that to say, um, it kind of makes me throw up my hands. I was like, why do I read books like this? Because they quote things, and I don't think they do it on purpose. I really don't think that they're trying to be misleading. I just think that when you're reading a book, keep in mind that you're having something of a conversation with the author of the book, and they might be somebody that's worth having a conversation with, but it doesn't mean that they have a perfect memory and a perfect understanding of all the elements of their argument. So the elements of their argument often are made up of sources. So worthwhile when you come across something that's weird, before you cast off things that you held to be true prior, go back and take a look at the sources and see if they really support the argument you're being presented with or not. Because it's easy to print something, and like you can print chapter and verse. Philo said this thing, and it seems very convincing. You're like, well, why would somebody say that's what he said? And he did quote him. He quoted him verbatim. He just didn't quote the stuff before and after, which kind of explains what Philo means by a solid, which is not a solid. And I don't think that John C. Collins is a bad man, or that he's being intentionally deceptive. It's just that um, he's not infallible, and nobody is. So when you're reading, hopefully you study, hopefully you dig into things on your own, hopefully you read books. Um, don't don't take quotations for granted. People will quote books, they'll quote sources, and if something seems weird to you, go back and look at the sources and see what they actually say, and you might be surprised. You may find out that they really do say what whoever it is you're in conversation with says they say, um, but they might not. There's always that chance, and I found it to be disturbingly frequent that what's being quoted doesn't really back up the argument that's being made. So ad fontes, go back to the sources as best you can. It's helpful that a lot of this stuff, like Philo, you could find online in the public domain. A lot of the oldest sources. And if you're willing to do some digging, I can read some Greek, so it's helpful to look at sites like Perseus Tufts. Um, but there's things like Blue Letter Bible won't have Philo on it. But if people are talking linguistic stuff, it's helpful to look back there, um, and do some homework. It might take some digging, um, but you can find most ancient sources online somewhere for free. This isn't free. I bought Philo for like $7 on Better World Books, um, but it was worth it, obviously, even just from this one one check. Okay, that's all.